Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, St. Nicholas and the Light of the East. I'm Jay Schaefer, the production coordinator for the Catholic Apostolate Center, and I'll be your host this afternoon as we welcome our guest speaker, Anne Koshute. Anne is an adjunct instructor at the St. Joseph's College of Maine, and we're pleased to have her with us today. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, please send me a message in the chat box on the bottom right of the screen and I'll help you out. You're also welcome to send me your questions to be answered at the end of the presentation. And now I'll turn things over to Anne.
Thanks a lot, Jay. I am so excited to be here with you today to talk about a person who is easily in the top 5 of my favorite saints of all time. And so I'm so grateful to the Catholic Apostolate Center for giving me this opportunity to share with you a person, a man, a saint who is just really so close to me and so close to my heart, and that is St. Nicholas. Now, this time of the year, I think, is especially a time that we want to look at St. Nicholas. He is a saint, I think, for all people and for all time and for all seasons. But particularly, I think now, in this time of the holidays, right? So Thanksgiving and then that rush into Christmas. It's just such a frantic time. There's so much busyness. There's cooking and menus and shopping, and there's really this kind of, I think, striving for perfection that we have. We want to make sure that everything is perfect, everything is right. Our lives kind of come down to tasks, things that we need to complete. Got to get the gifts, got to check everything off of our list, got to do the shopping and all of the entertaining. And we become so busy that we can really tend to forget, I think, what it is that we're preparing for and that we're celebrating. And the fact that this really isn't a holiday season, but it's a holy season, and we're preparing for a holy day, which is Christmas. And St. Nicholas, I think, is really a beautiful model for us as we prepare for the coming of Jesus Christ, as we prepare for his birth. And of course, we know that he is so closely associated with the Christmas season. We're going to see a little bit about how that association came about, and really look at the facts and the historical reality of this Saint Nicholas, who is so closely associated with this time of the year. You know, as I was preparing for this webinar, I, of course, was doing my research, and I was taking a look at historical facts and trying to get my geography and my dates all in line. But when it comes down to it, this is really, I think, a webinar, a talk that comes from my heart, because St. Nicholas means so much to me, and he has been a favorite saint of mine ever since I was a child. So what I'm hoping to bring to you in this brief time that we have together is really an introduction to this man, Nicholas, who has done so many great things. He's a Wonderworker, he's a champion of the faith, but really at heart, he was a good and holy man who loved God, loved Jesus Christ and the church above all else. And, you know, we're so fortunate that we have the communion of saints. We have all of these people who have gone before us in heaven, who are praying for us and who are interceding for us and who are really on our side. And Nicholas is just one of those people. He is one of those saints who's on our side. So I really hope that through the course of this webinar, you'll get a nice introduction to St. Nicholas, and maybe you can really add him to your list of friends that you have in heaven, and that he can really be a help to you as you prepare for the coming of Christ, for his birth at Christmas. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, St. Nicholas is not your Father Christmas, although, as I said, he really has become so closely associated with Christmas. And you see that I have some representations of Santa Claus here on the screen. Santa Claus is great. I love him. We all love him, right? but he is not the same thing as St. Nicholas. He's not that same person. And so it's really, I think, important for us to make that distinction. Somewhere along the line, St. Nicholas kind of morphed into this character that we know as Santa Claus. But really, we begin with this historical figure of Nicholas. Now, sometime later on in the Middle Ages, around the time of the Protestant Reformation, there was a real push to kind of put the saints to the side, to take away from these practices of revering the saints and praying to them and asking their intercession. So that's really kind of where this winding back of a reverence and celebrations around St. Nicholas happened. From very early in the church, during his life and after his death, people really revered St. Nicholas and saw him as this wonderful and holy figure. But around the time of the Middle Ages, as things were changing, the Protestant Reformation happens, and there is more of a hostility about all things Catholic, and especially toward the saints. There was this move away from St. Nicholas, an effort to try to divert attention from him. And so you begin to get figures like Kris Kringle, and then later on Father Christmas. And this this tradition of gift giving is moved from the Feast of St. Nicholas to Christmas Day. You begin to have figures that help the Christ child to bring gifts to children. And finally, later on in the 1600s, you begin to get this figure called Sinterklaas, who later on, of course, when he's brought to America by the Dutch, morphs into the person really that we know today as Santa Claus. Then, of course, in 1822, the famous poem written by Clement C. Moore, A Visit from St. Nicholas, right? We all know that poem. Probably we know it better as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. And this really began to solidify Santa Claus in our consciousness. Now, the poem was called A Visit from St. Nicholas, but it really does kind of mark this transition from the St. Nicholas that we know from the late 3rd and early 4th century into this person that we now know as Santa Claus. And that transition was pretty much made complete. You can see some of these representations of Santa Claus on the screen with, of course, the red suit. Initially, his suit was a little bit longer, so it mimicked a little bit more kind of the bishop's robe, but eventually that changed to that shorter coat. He became the jolly fat man with the hat and the fuzzy white beard. And that transition away from the real figure of St. Nicholas was made complete. So even though we love Santa Claus, and you know, as a kid, I put out my milk and cookies and I waited for him to come. You know, on Christmas Eve, I waited in anticipation. He's not the same as St. Nicholas, not at all. And there's nothing wrong with that, but this is the time when you might want to scoot the children out of the room for a second, because the real difference between Santa Claus and St. Nicholas is that St. Nicholas is a real historical figure, not a creation or really a mythical character like Santa Claus. St. Nicholas is a real person who lived at the end of the 3rd and into the early 4th century. And he was really well known during his life, really honored and revered as a very holy man, a real model for holiness, a defender of the faith, a healer, and really a miracle worker. So he was really well known at the time of his life, and then after he died, he continued to be really honored, and a lot of churches came to be named for him. As we'll see in a few moments, he really became a patron of the church. there were also a lot of legends and stories that grew up around St. Nicholas, and we're going to look at those more in depth in a couple of minutes. But he's also really known to be a great intercessor, especially for couples, married couples, particularly those who are having difficulty conceiving. He's a patron saint for travelers. He's even the patron saint for reformed thieves, and that might be my most favorite aspect of St. Nicholas. So he really has a wide appeal to a lot of people, and he really can be such a friend and a help to all of us at many different stages and through many difficulties in our lives. So what I want to try to bring out for you today about St. Nicholas is the fact that he's a father, and I mean that in the sense of being a spiritual father. St. Nicholas was a true spiritual father during his life. He was really somebody who cared about the people that he encountered. As a priest and as a bishop, he cared very deeply about his flock. He was a conscientious and a holy and a very loving shepherd. But this was also true of anybody that he encountered in his life, and we'll see that in a moment. He really was a spiritual father, and he continues to be so as he intercedes for us on our behalf in heaven. St. Nicholas was also, at the time of his life, known to be a wonder-worker. In fact, one of his names is St. Nicholas the Wonder-Worker. And he's known to really have been a healer and to have done some pretty amazing things. Now, some of those things might be a little bit embellished, a little bit of the stuff of legend, but they're really great stories. And I think that at the heart of them is the truth about St. Nicholas, the truth about this man who really went out of himself and went above and beyond to really help people, in need, to be a merciful and caring father to others. And Nicholas was a defender of the true faith, and we'll see in a moment just the lengths that he went to. From a very young age, really as a child, he was in love with God, and he was in love with God's church. And so he really became a person who defended the faith against all sorts of attacks, internally and externally. And he did everything that he could to just show God's love and to bring other people into his love, to really be someone who invited people to know Jesus Christ and to worship him and to become a part of his community, his family, which is the church. Now, as I said, Santa is jolly, but St. Nicholas is a father. And he's not the father of Santa Claus, but he is a father in his own right, as I said, because of his generosity and his real care for his flock and for all of the people that he encountered. But he's really also known to be a father of the faith, the one true faith, and a father of the church. Now, by this, I don't mean he's like the traditional church fathers that we know. For example, St. Basil, St. Augustine, St. Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, those kinds of men who we call fathers of the church, who really did a lot of the theological work in the early centuries of the church to kind of work through doctrine and to do a lot of writing. Nicholas wasn't a father of the church in that sense. We really don't have any of his writings at all. We don't know if he ever wrote anything. There's no homilies like with the great John Chrysostom. Those aren't written down. He didn't seem to write any letters or treatises that we have. And so he's not really known to be a theologian in that sense. But he is a father of the church because he so staunchly defended the faith. And he really is a father and a patron of the Eastern churches. And so that's where we get part of this title for this webinar, St. Nicholas and the Light of the East, because St. Nicholas is a real patron and father for those of us who are members of the churches of the East. Both Catholic and Orthodox Christians of the East really revere and honor St. Nicholas as a patron and a father. And so to kind of flesh out a little bit what that means, and before we can really talk too much more about St. Nicholas, I want to just make mention of kind of the other Catholics that are part of the church. And so I want to just take a moment to kind of turn our attention eastward and take a look at what that means to talk about Eastern Catholics and Orthodox Christians as well. One of the reasons that St. Nicholas really is so important to me and was such an important part of my family and my spiritual life growing up is because I am an Eastern or a Byzantine Catholic. And so, you know, we could really do a whole other webinar just on the Eastern churches, and the history would take a long time to flesh out, much less all of the spirituality and the liturgical tradition. But what I want to say is that I think many Catholics, many people don't realize that the Catholic Church is actually a communion of churches. And certainly when we hear things about the Catholic Church on the news, especially coming up at Christmas time, there will be reports about the world's billion Roman Catholics. That's really not accurate because it doesn't cover the church in its entirety. The Catholic Church is a communion of 24 churches. The largest one is Rome. The other 23 are the Eastern churches. And again, there's a history that goes along with this, but to not get too deep into the weeds, suffice it to say that these Eastern churches are all part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And all of these churches have their origin in Christ and the apostles. So we know that after Jesus ascended into heaven, the apostles were filled with the Holy Spirit, and then they went out and preached, and they established churches. And those different churches grew and spread, and then eventually people evangelized to really all parts of the known world at that time, and then, as we know now, into the whole world. And so the Eastern Catholic Church that I belong to, the Byzantine Catholic Church, has its origin in the Apostle Andrew. And sometime later on, in around 863, 864, the apostles to the Slavs, as they're called, St. Cyril and Methodius, evangelized the Slavic people and converted them to Christianity, actually gave them an alphabet, which we now know as Cyrillic, and those people became Christians, Eastern Catholic Christians. And they developed their own unique spirituality and way of praying the liturgy. And today, those Christians survive all over the world, and that Byzantine Catholic Church in America actually took St. Nicholas as its patron. So in every Byzantine Catholic church, at least across this country, you will find an icon of St. Nicholas very prominently displayed in the church. Now, up on the screen right now, I actually have a picture from my own parish of St. Anne Byzantine Catholic Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And you'll see in the center is a picture of what kind of looks like a screen or almost a wall, and that's called the iconostasis or the iconostas. And that is a screen that separates the sanctuary, which we call the Holy of Holies, from the congregation. And during the Divine Liturgy, which is what we call the Mass, those doors in the middle are called the royal doors, and they open up, and then we can see into the sanctuary and see where the priest is offering the sacrifice. Now, I'm oftentimes asked if, as a Byzantine Catholic, the priest, when he's celebrating liturgy, has his back to the people. And I always respond that he doesn't have his back to the people, but we are all facing in the same direction. And that's how the liturgy is celebrated, with us all facing, all turning our faces, turning our minds and our hearts to God, all offering ourselves and the liturgy. We're all turned in the same direction toward God. On the iconostas are depicted scenes from the life of Christ, and also are depicted Christ himself, the Blessed Mother. On the our right-hand side is the icon of whomever is the patron of that church. In this case, it's St. Anne, so there's an icon of her. And then on the left, always to the left of Mary, to the left as you're facing the iconostas, is the icon of St. Nicholas, because he is the patron of our church. And I have a close-up there also of that icon. So you can see just what a prominent position he has in the church, and specifically the prominence that and the reverence with which we hold St. Nicholas in the Eastern churches. So I'd really encourage you to, if you can, to learn more about the Eastern churches, the Eastern Catholic churches. If you have a Byzantine church or another Eastern church in your area, drop by, have a visit, go to the liturgy, talk to the priest, find out more about it. I'll have my email at the end of this webinar too, so if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know, because I'd love to tell you more about our religious and liturgical and spiritual tradition. All right, so I said that St. Nicholas is really kind of a complex character, and so of course I say that we're going to talk about the man, the myth, and the legends. And this so often happens, I think, when you have people who are kind of larger than life. Their stories take on a bit of a life of their own. And so St. Nicholas is this real historical character, very complex, very rich tradition surrounding him, but also a lot of stories that, frankly, were probably embellished. I think that they all have this core of truth to them, but as often happens with people of great prominence, people that we admire, stories can become embellished. I think, for example, about one of our own founding fathers in America, George Washington, right? How he was a man of such high character, and he did so many amazing things as a general and then as president, so integral to the founding of our country. But one of the things that we all learn as children growing up in America is that one day the young George Washington chopped down a cherry tree, and when he got caught, he famously said, "I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the tree," right? Well, we're pretty certain that that's historically not accurate, that that story never happened. But because he's a man of such prominence and people want to talk about him and sort of spread his deeds and his bravery and all of the things that he did, they want to spread that far and wide. Sometimes these stories become a little bit embellished. And that's happened a little bit with St. Nicholas, but for me, especially growing up, I thought that was kind of what made him really cool. For me, as a child growing up, St. Nicholas really was kind of like a superhero. He was sort of like the original superhero in the wonderful things that he did. And just hearing those stories about him, I think, tended to, for me, really reinforce how awesome and wonderful he is. And I think those are the things that kind of helped me to fall in love with him as a child and to really grow in my love for him as I learned more about him growing up and as an adult. So let's take a closer look at Nicholas. First, we'll look at St. Nicholas the man. St. Nicholas's parents were called Theophanes and Nona, and they actually had a difficult time conceiving, and that became one of the reasons why Nicholas is a patron for couples who are experiencing infertility. So, of course, as is the kind of biblical tradition, when these things happen, they prayed to God and they promised God that if they conceived, they would dedicate their child to him. And God heard their prayer and answered it. And so Nicholas was really kind of a miracle child from the barrenness of Theophanes and Nona. And so he was born in 270 AD in Patara, which is on the south coast of Asia Minor. He eventually moved to a town called Myra in what is now modern-day Turkey. And so he's often referred to as St. Nicholas of Myra. And that's probably also to just distinguish him from some other saints, later saints, who are also named Nicholas. So, true to their word, his parents really dedicated him to God right from the beginning and educated him in the faith. And it seems that right from the beginning, St. Nicholas really took to that study of the word and picked up on his parents' love for God, because he fell in love with the church very early on and really fell in love with God from childhood. And so he was known to study the scriptures. He was known to pray very fervently and devoutly. One of those stories that kind of grew up about Nicholas in these legends, and there is an icon that depicts it as well. It's said that Nicholas stood up in the baptismal font and was sort of standing in a stance of prayer. There's also a story that says on Wednesdays and Fridays he abstained from the breast in order to kind of keep the practice of fasting during the Lenten season. So again, these are kind of fantastic stories that I think are probably not true, but I just think that they kind of add to that mystique around St. Nicholas, and they're just kind of cool stories. But there's plenty about the real historical Nicholas that we have to really find as a model of holiness, and to really see him as someone who was of very high character and who really was quite humble and loving toward his neighbor. Eventually, of course, because of his love for God and his great devotion to the church, Nicholas decided to become a priest. And so he was ordained to the priesthood. And at some point during his priesthood, he made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And while he was there, he really felt this stirring toward the monastic life, and he really felt like that's what he wanted to do, and that's where he was called, was to live the life of a monk. And he did do that for a couple of years. He lived as a monk until it is said that Christ himself called him back to the active ministry. And it's said that the Lord said to him, "Nicholas, this is not the vineyard where you shall bear fruit by me. Return to the world and glorify my name there." And so Nicholas heeded the word of God, and he left the monastery and went back into his active ministry. And eventually he was consecrated as a bishop. And so he became the bishop of Myra. And that's why you see him most often depicted wearing those bishop's robes, and oftentimes you'll see him also wearing a crown. In those more Roman depictions of Nicholas, he's wearing a mitre, like you will see any Roman Catholic bishop wear today. But many of the depictions of Nicholas have him wearing a crown, if he's wearing anything on his head at all. And the crown is what the Eastern bishops wear instead of that traditional kind of pointed mitre of the Roman Church. So that was St. Nicholas the man. Now, again, because he was a person of such high prominence and because people admired him so much, I think some of these stories began to bubble up as his name and his deeds kind of made their rounds out into the public consciousness. And so one of the things that is, I think, kind of a myth surrounding Nicholas is that he attended the Council of Nicaea, which happened in 325 AD. Now, if you recall, or you may not know, that early on in the church, there was a lot to work out. I mean, Jesus comes, and he's the Son of God, and he dies, and he's raised again, and there were a lot of deep theological revelations as a result of Christ and his incarnation, and then spreading the gospel and spreading the message of our salvation to the world. So there was really a lot to work out early on in those early centuries of the Christian faith. And so there was a lot of kind of confusion and even some fighting about certain theological principles and doctrines, things that we now know to be doctrines of our faith. And those things were being worked out. And so the Emperor Constantine, in order to help that process, called this Council of Nicaea and called bishops and also priests together to try to work through some of these things so that the church could get the actual teaching, the authentic teaching about God, about Jesus Christ. And that's where the Nicene Creed that we say at the Mass or at the liturgy was developed, that proclamation of our faith, the essential things that we believe about our faith, that we believe about God. And so there were bishops and priests who were called to this council, and there was a lot of discussion and debate. And one of the principal areas of debate was about the divinity of Christ. And there was a priest of Alexandria called Arius, and he was really insisting and claiming that there was a time when Jesus Christ was not. In other words, he was saying that Jesus, the Son of God, was a creation of God, that he wasn't eternal with the Father, that he was not God. And so there were a lot of people who sided with Arius, but there were a lot of people who were on the other side too and said, no, Jesus is God. And there was a lot of discussion and debate. And of course, we know that what ended up happening was there was that decision that the revelation of God is that he is Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He is of one essence or of one substance with God, and he is eternal. But during those debates, it got very tense, and the story, the myth, where our friend St. Nicholas comes in, is that he was part of this Council of Nicaea, and that during these debates, Arius was so forceful in his claim against the divinity of Christ that Nicholas became very frustrated, and he walked across the room and he slapped Arius across the face, or in some accounts it says he boxed his ears. Some accounts say that he punched him, but it seems like it was probably a slap. And so that was sort of a burst of anger from Nicholas to try to quiet down this heresy. It's not really certain that Nicholas was actually at the council. In fact, there's no record of him at all being there. But there must be some grain of truth there. There must be some reason for this story to kind of grow up into the legend and be part of the legend of St. Nicholas. In fact, even in the liturgical tradition of the Byzantine Church, I found some hymns that come from Matins and also from Vespers that refer to this. Specifically in the Vespers for the Feast of St. Nicholas, there is a hymn that says, "With what songs of praise shall we extol the most saintly Nicholas? He is the foe of wickedness. He is an outstanding leader, a most powerful defender in distress, and a great teacher of the church. He confounds all those who dishonor." And then it says, "He is the refuter of Arius and his companions. Because of him, Christ put down their ragings and showed great mercy." So even though he is not listed as one of the council fathers, I guess it's possible that he was there, and I suppose it's even possible that he gave Arius a little slap. But also we find in some of the accounts that he did go to Arius later on and apologize for his behavior. So whether or not this story about Nicholas is true, I think it shows that, for one thing, he really was known as a defender of the true faith, and that he was really ardent about defending Christ and his divinity. But I think it also shows that God really kind of takes us where we are, even in our flaws and our personality, our foibles, and he can still use that. If we look, for example, at the Apostle Peter or even at St. Paul, they both had their weaknesses and their moments of upset or confusion or whatever it might be, their imperfections. And yet God uses those, he works with those to bring about good. And so I think that that's something that we can really take from that story of St. Nicholas, whether or not that particular incident is true. But one thing that we can say is that it did create some really fun memes around this idea of St. Nicholas slapping the heretic Arius. And I have a couple of those up on the screen right now. They're really pretty funny. I particularly like the one that's at the lower right of the screen. "I came to eat pierogi and punch heretic in face. Pierogi gone." I like that one because I'm a Slav and we love our pierogis. But anyway, I think that these memes are just kind of funny, and you know, I think sometimes, you know, we should never make fun of the faith, but I think we can have a bit of humor and a little bit of fun with it. And again, I think it really just shows that God takes us in our flaws. He takes us exactly where we are, and he can really bring good from that and bring out good in us too. Okay. So again, St. Nicholas, a defender of the faith, whether or not he actually was at the Council of Nicaea, we do know that he was imprisoned for his faith. In 303 AD, the rights of Christians in the Roman Empire were once again revoked, and there was another wave of persecutions where Christians really were discriminated against and were persecuted, and some even thrown into prison. And we know that this was the case with St. Nicholas, and he was probably in prison for a couple of years, actually. But it's also known that he ministered while he was in prison. He ministered to his flock as best he could, and certainly to the people with whom he was imprisoned. After his release, finally, when the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and made it safe again for Christian practice, St. Nicholas was known again to be a real defender of the faith and a restoration of the faith. And so he is known to have gone into some pagan temples and destroyed some of the statuary to get rid of the idols to the pagan gods. And by some accounts, he even drove out demons in some of these temples, which I can believe may have actually been residing in some of these pagan temples. And so even though there is that sort of mythological aspect of him as defender of the faith, there is real historical evidence for him not only defending the faith, but really suffering for it. And praise God, he was not killed, because he was able to continue to go on and to do a lot of good works for the people and to really preach the gospel. But he did suffer during that time of imprisonment. In fact, there are some remains that are found of St. Nicholas where his relics reside, and it has been said that it seems as if the nose was probably broken, and so they believe that may have happened during the time of his imprisonment. So he really did suffer for the faith. Now, I said also that there are a lot of legends or a lot of stories around St. Nicholas, and I think that many of these are true. Some of them have probably been embellished, but it's absolutely certain that Nicholas was a very generous man. Theophanes and Nona were quite wealthy, Nicholas's parents. And after they died, of course, Nicholas inherited their wealth. And it's said that he gave away his wealth one coin at a time. And so I really look at St. Nicholas in a way as a kind of Eastern St. Francis. He was a person who did not think that material possessions were important at all. And so he gave away his money, not all at once, but he held on to it and portioned it out as he saw the need. And I have some representations. There are a few icons and other paintings on the screen right now that represent a couple of those stories around St. Nicholas's generosity, as well as his ability as a healer and a Wonderworker. And these are stories that I loved as a child. My parents told me the stories. I was fortunate enough to go to Catholic school, to a Byzantine Catholic elementary school, and so the sisters told us these stories. They were reinforced to us by our pastor during the liturgical celebration of St. Nicholas, and they really are wonderful because they can especially capture the imagination of a child, and so they can become really great ways of teaching children about this saint. In one story, Nicholas, when he was on his way to that pilgrimage in Jerusalem, was in the boat, and a storm came up, a really fierce, dangerous storm, and it is said that St. Nicholas prayed and he was able to calm the sea. And all of the passengers and the sailors on the boat were so grateful to him. And that's one of the reasons that he has become the patron for sailors. Another one, you can see it as you're looking at the screen at the top right, another great story, and where we get some of the traditions surrounding the celebration of St. Nicholas, is that there were 3 daughters of a man who did not have enough money to pay a dowry. And so he was preparing to sell these daughters into prostitution because he didn't have any money. And St. Nicholas heard about this, and one night he was walking by the home of the man and his daughters, and through the open window he tossed some bags of coins, or in some accounts it says that he tossed in bags of gold that were kind of shaped like round balls. And so he threw those into the window, and the next day the man discovered them, and he was able to have enough money for the dowry, and he didn't need to sell his daughters into prostitution. Later on, he finds out that it was Nicholas who was so generous to him, and he's thankful to him. But one of the marks of St. Nicholas's generosity was his humility, that he was never audacious or showy about his generosity. And most of the time when he gave to people, he did so anonymously, because he didn't want the focus to be on himself. He really wanted the focus to always be on God, and ultimately God's generosity to all of us. There's another story about 3 young generals who were falsely accused and were about ready to be executed, and St. Nicholas sort of came in at the last minute just before they were ready to behead the first general, and he proclaimed the 3 men's innocence. He had seen what happened in a vision and saw that they were basically set up. And so he came and rescued them from execution. There is another story that was told when I was a kid about 3 young men, 3 youths who were kidnapped. And they were kidnapped by a butcher who actually killed them and ground them up into sausage. And when Nicholas found out about this, he went there and kind of exposed to this person so that he could be dealt with justly, and he was actually able to heal these 3 youths and bring them back to life. That one I'm pretty sure is not true, but when you're a kid, it makes a really awesome story. So these are the legends, the stories, many of them true, some of them probably embellished, that I remember just so well from my childhood, and they have stayed with me all of these years. And I think, again, that, you know, they're really a way to capture the imagination of children and to teach them about this saint, and to teach some really good lessons, too, about humility and generosity and reaching out to people who are less fortunate than we are, and telling the truth, and not falsely accusing other people, and not just trying to get ahead, but to always put others before us. So part of St. Nicholas and honoring him is to really celebrate him. And again, you know, St. Nicholas was very important in my family, important to me as a child from when I was very small. There was never in our family or in our church, there was never a question that Santa Claus and St. Nicholas were 2 very different people. We loved Santa Claus, and we waited in anticipation for him to bring us our gifts, and we made the case to our parents about how good we were, so that they would plead our case to Santa so that he would bring us some good treats. But St. Nicholas, we always knew, was a saint, and we knew those stories that I just related to you about him, and we loved him, and we really celebrated him, and continue to do that today. So St. Nicholas is a saint who's celebrated and revered in the Roman Church, as well. But in the Eastern churches, as I said, he really holds a place of prominence. And on the calendar, his feast day is celebrated on December 6th. And that is a day for praying and celebrating at home, and also for attending the Divine Liturgy, for going to church and praising God and thanking him for the gift of St. Nicholas, who is really a person who brings the faith to us, a person who really points us toward Christ. And that, I think, is how St. Nicholas would want us to remember him the most, to keep his memory always by remembering Christ, always by going to church, by receiving the Eucharist, and by praying. So for me, growing up, that was always an integral part of our celebration, just as it was with Christmas. Presents and all of the things that go along with that are great and important, and we were excited about them. But number one was always the celebration of God, celebrating the liturgy and praying and honoring St. Nicholas in that way. Now, the best way to celebrate St. Nicholas at home, of course, is to show the kind of generosity that Nicholas himself showed. And so traditionally, for my family, for Eastern Catholics, especially for the Slavic people, celebrating St. Nicholas meant that the children put their shoes out right outside their doors of their room on the eve of the feast. So on December 5th, we as kids would put our shoes outside, and the next morning we would wake up and we would find some wonderful treats from St. Nicholas. Those could include some candy, some chocolates, sometimes the little chocolate coins to recall the coins that Nicholas gave to the three women, the three daughters. Sometimes people will put oranges in the shoes, and that is kind of a reference to the gold, because those round pieces of gold look like oranges, and so that's kind of a reference to the gold that Nicholas gave to the three girls. And any sorts of little treats or candies can go in the shoes. This is a great kind of tradition and a way to teach people about St. Nicholas, to teach your children about St. Nicholas, to tell the stories, to say a prayer to Nicholas, and then to put your shoes out. But, you know, this can really be done by anyone. Adults, couples can share in this way, can celebrate Nicholas in this way too. And it can be a really fun way to, you know, exchange treats and little gifts to remember St. Nicholas. Before I was married, I lived in a house with 4 other Catholic women, and I told them the story of St. Nicholas, and I had them all set out their shoes, and the next morning they all received little treats from St. Nicholas. So it was an opportunity for us, just as friends, to pray and to celebrate with each other. And I think that celebrating the Feast of St. Nicholas is great for us, especially now in this hyper-consumer era that we live in, you know, where we're already getting ready for and celebrating Christmas way before it even comes, because we're shopping and, you know, we're doing all of that busyness. And so St. Nicholas Day, falling there on the 6th, a couple of weeks before Christmas, is a great opportunity for us to just really step back and kind of re-examine what it is that we're doing. That, again, we're not celebrating a holiday, but a holy day. And so celebrating the Feast of St. Nicholas with candy and treats and putting your shoes out and praying and telling stories about Nicholas, I think is a great way to kind of slow us down a little bit. And I think it's exactly what Nicholas would want, to turn our gaze really on Christ once again. Now, no celebration of St. Nicholas is complete without singing the hymn to St. Nicholas. This is a song that I learned as a child. We still sing it at the liturgy today for St. Nicholas's feast. And I think when I was growing up, all the little kids learned this song in celebration and in honor of St. Nicholas. I won't sing it because I'm not a singer, but I have a few of the lines up on the screen right now. Oh, who loves Nicholas the saintly? Oh, who serves Nicholas the saintly? Him will Nicholas receive and give help in time of need. Holy Father, Nicholas. Again, just a great way for kids to get involved and to capture their imagination and to really teach them that the saints, like St. Nicholas, are our friends, and they're people who we can be close to and we can talk to and we can bring our problems to and ask the saints to take our needs and our desires and our wishes right to the throne of God. So again, I think St. Nicholas is wonderful to help us prepare for the coming of Christ. You know, Mary is the Mother of God, and in the East we call her the Theotokos, which means the God-bearer. And I think in many ways St. Nicholas was also a God-bearer. He brought God and he brought the love of Christ to everyone he encountered, whether he was defending the faith or he was teaching his flock, or he was giving out of his abundance to someone who was really in need. He was bringing Christ to others, and he continues to do that today as he intercedes for us and as we look to him as an example. And so this year on St. Nicholas's feast day, you know, pray to him and ask him to help you to really be a God-bearer, to conceive Christ in your hearts and to give birth to him in the world in whatever way you can do it, wherever you are, whatever your gifts, whatever your capabilities, in whatever generous ways you can share the love of God with others. Now, St. Nicholas fell asleep in the Lord in 343 AD, and he died in Myra, where he was living. But eventually, during the invasion of the Saracens in 1087, his relics were transferred to Bari, Italy, and that is where they still reside today. In fact, you can go and visit the church in Bari, the basilica, and you can visit St. Nicholas's tomb. I have a picture of it up on the screen right now. It is said, and not just said, but it's known because people have seen it, that there is a liquid that exudes from Nicholas's tomb. It's not quite oil, not quite water, but it's some sort of liquid, and it's often referred to as the manna of St. Nicholas. And it's been known to have really healing powers, physically and spiritually healing powers. And so people still go to Bari today to visit St. Nicholas's tomb, to venerate it, and to seek his intercession. And that is one of the places, as a great lover of St. Nicholas, that is on my bucket list. I really want to visit Bari and be able to visit St. Nicholas. Well, that was a really a whirlwind tour through the life of St. Nicholas. I have on the screen a couple of resources that you can check out just to do some of your own research. You want to learn a little bit more about St. Nicholas. The St. Nicholas Center, stnicholas.org, is a great place to find a lot of information about the saint and about some of the legends and the stories that surround him. The Institute of Catholic Culture is also a great place to go to learn about all things Byzantine and Eastern Catholic, and so that's a great resource. And of course, the Catholic Apostolate Center, resources about everything to do with evangelization, which is, of course, what St. Nicholas was all about, because he really wanted to evangelize and to bring the faith and bring Christ to others. But they also have some really good Advent resources. So as we're all preparing for the coming of Christ, we can check out those resources. And I would love it if you would also add to your arsenal of spiritual reading and preparation, if you would add St. Nicholas. I really hope that you get to know him for his generosity and his kindness, and to really adopt some of the joy that Nicholas had, that joy of praising God and that joy of giving of himself to others, spiritually, physically, monetarily. That is really what this time of year is about, to learn how to give of ourselves to others, to really give Christ to others, to invite others to know God and to understand that he is love and that he loves each one of us so much. That's exactly what St. Nicholas's mission was, in his quiet and humble but really generous way. So I hope that this has at least whet your appetite a bit to learn some more about this wonderful saint. Don't forget to put your shoes out on December 5th, and on December 6th, really remember St. Nicholas. Pray to him and ask him to help you to become a better person, to become a better Christian, to love God more, and to be generous with all of your gifts. Thank you so much for being with me. God bless you, and happy St. Nicholas Day.
Thanks again, Anne, for joining us, and thank you to everyone who tuned in with us this afternoon. We'll have a recording of this webinar uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next week, so please keep an eye out there and on our website, CatholicApostolatecenter.org, for the link. You're welcome to share it with anyone you'd like. As always, all of our content is free to share. And if you haven't yet found us on social media, please like and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, in the hope that we'll continue to reach more people with the message of the gospel. And finally, in the words of our patron, St. Vincent Pallotti, may the charity of Christ urge you on. Good afternoon, and God bless.